Welcome to Lecture 4 for International Regulatory Frameworks for Climate Change and Environmental Management. So we are continuing on from our lectures yesterday where we looked at the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade and the Antarctic Treaty, and we're moving on to look at a suite of treaties that were negotiated in the early 1970s. So we're leaping forward. So the Ramsar Convention, the World Heritage Convention, CITES, the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, 1971, 72, 73. So in outline, what we'll cover in this lecture are those three major treaties, as well as I just mentioned the Stockholm Conference in 1972 and the Bonn Convention in 1979. So the context, you recall yesterday when we looked at the UN Charter and the like, it was in the context of 1945 to 1960, and I said it was a period of post-World War II rebuilding, little interest in the environment, very few treaties negotiated during that period. Okay, so if we jump forward into the I'm going to just say 1960 to 1980, and if we think about this period of history, can I summarise it in just a few dot points? So firstly, it's an ongoing period of rapid industrial growth and population growth in many parts of the world, driven by major technological advances. So that's the same as the past period. But importantly, in the difference to the earlier period is that government and public concern for the environment merges. There's groundbreaking environmental treaties are negotiated, and when we think about the modern system, the World Heritage Convention, the Ramsar Convention, they're cornerstones of what we think of as modern international environmental regulation. So, prior to the 70s, that just didn't exist. So you just had this world with basically nothing, basically nothing in terms of environmental regulation. This is the absolute foundation of their modern system. And it's reflecting public concern. So as I said, international regulation or regulation generally is very much driven by public opinion. So this is reflecting the public concern. The Cold War between the USA and the USSR continues. The US is defeated in the Vietnam War during this period. There's a threat of nuclear war. A groundbreak or a seminal book was written in the 1962. So Silent Spring, written by Rachel Carson, is often seen as the start of the modern environmental movement in the USA, Europe, Australia. So, and an incredible book written about, and it captures. I love books where their titles capture something, really valuable, and you effectively capture the essence of the idea just in the title. So Carlson's basic message was that the widespread use of pesticides in the US was decimating bird populations, and that if this continued, we faced the future where there would be no birds. It's a no bird song in spring. So hence the title, Silent Spring, no birds. So this is just an extract of, not an obituary, but a reflection on 50 years since Silent Spring, written in 2012. So this year marks the 50th anniversary of the release of Rachel Carlson's Silent Spring, a book often credited with launching the modern environmental movement. As we celebrate recent vital regulations from new fuel economy standards and carbon pollution standards, it's important to look back and think how this one book moved the United States public to realise the importance of environmental protection and called the government to action. So in Silent Spring, Carlson broke down 4 years of research into the harmful effects of DDT, a pesticide first used to kill malaria-causing insects for US troops, etc., and then the generous use of it basically led to consequences of killing a lot of animals, so bioaccumulation in the food chain. So a really important book. Also, in the context of thinking about the history of this period and what drove public opinion to be so concerned. So, okay, we've got the swinging 60s, the hippies and those sorts of things in the US and Australia and Europe, but they're driven also by what was in the news at that time. And one of the major events in terms of environmental concern was the Torrey Canyon disaster, which I'll also talk about in the next lecture when I talk about MARPOL, the marine pollution laws. But just in terms of setting the history, so Torrey Canyon was a major, one of the largest oil tankers of its day. And in good weather, it was sailing to the United Kingdom. And in those days, they used to judge the, navigation wasn't just a GPS. You weren't just, although even, anyway, navigation wasn't as exact. And they used to basically work out the distance from shore by triangulating points. And they misjudged their distance from the shore and struck a rock called Wolf Rock. It was well known. It had been well known for centuries. It wasn't marked on charts. It's that they mistook where they were, and they hit this rock. And the ship, basically, it was a massive oil tanker for its day. It foundered on the rocks, eventually broke up, and then the Royal Air Force, to deal with the oil, deliberately bombed it. And set it alight, and so this is the fires in Life magazine. So photographs from that period. So that was a major event. Also wanted to play, if this is going to play for me, I was trying it earlier and it didn't. Wanted to come in with another soundtrack, but just going to play the first minute.
There was a time in this country when people went outside and they realized the air isn't as clean as it used to be. Water isn't drinkable everywhere.
People used to be choking. People used to be getting sick and dying from the pollution in the cities back then.
We had a problem with acid rain. The ozone layer was depleting because of chlorofluorocarbons. The bald eagle was threatened by the rampant use of DDT, a pesticide to thin the shells of eagles.
Rivers that seem to burn in the middle of the day because of the discharges. Children with mercury poisoning. Those were all consequences of an unregulated free-for-all.
There was basically a broad public movement to clean it up.
America sat down in the 1970s. They went out on the streets in Earth Day, record numbers, and they said, we need to fix this. And thus the EPA was born.
The time has come for man to make his peace with nature. We must act, and act decisively. We have passed new laws to protect the environment, but there is much yet to be done.
When it passed in 1970, there was one vote in all the House and the Senate against the Clean Air Act.
The Clean Air Act that EPA standards set under that law has been successful in cutting dozens of examples of pollutants by as much as 80%.
The American people breathe easier. Could be better, but they breathe easier.
I'm going to pause it just there. I thought that was useful historic footage. So, and that legislation, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act in the US, drove a lot of other jurisdictions to enact similar domestic legislation. So in Australia, we had similar in Queensland even, we had similar Clean Water, Clean Air Act legislation. And also environmental impact assessment was born in the National Environmental Protection Act of 1969 in the US. So that was where EIS came from, that now is just a cornerstone of modern environmental regulation. So all of those things emerged at that period. Driven very much in the vanguard was the United States of America. And so that's what's happening domestically. And it also then leads to action at an international level. So groundbreaking international environmental treaties were negotiated during this period, the 60s, and then it all comes together in the 70s, so to speak. So we've got the Convention on Wetlands of International Importance, especially as waterfowl habitat, signed in 1971. So it's got a really long title, and everyone calls it the Ramsar Convention, based on this, which reflects the city in Iran where it was signed. And wetlands on it are called Ramsar wetlands. So in summary, There's 169 contracting parties, so bear in mind, as we said yesterday, 193 countries or members of the UN. You know, you could add a few for countries that are real countries but not UN states, but you know, 193 to 196 countries in the world. This is a very, very popular convention. Virtually all countries have signed up to it, you know, 170 out of 190 odd. Over 2,000 listed sites. The Conference of the Contracting Parties, the COP, meets every 3 years, and the Ramsar Secretariat is based in Gland in Switzerland, and it manages the day-to-day activities of the convention. And you've got ramsar.org is its website, a fantastic website. So just to summarise the convention, so yesterday with the Whaling Convention, I gave you the whole thing. I'm not going to do that for other conventions. I'm just going to summarise them. Can I emphasise you don't have to worry about the detail of the articles? I'm just putting them up because I would like you to be, at the end of this course, basically thinking, oh yeah, I've seen a lot of conventions, they're not that hard, they start with some definitions, there's a few provisions in them that say the generic obligations, but I have to go and look at the decisions of the parties, and there's typically, like for Ramsar or World Heritage, there's a big manual, so I need to go and find that. If I'm really, if you're going to work on that topic in detail, I just want you to be aware of those things. So it's just about familiarity. You don't have to remember what's in Article 1 of the Ramsar Convention. I'm not going to ask you about it on the exam. If I did ask you about it, it would be to give you the article and ask you to interpret some part of it, but it would be really obvious. Everyone happy with that? Okay, so Article 1. Some definitions. For the purposes of this convention, wetlands are areas of marsh, fen, peatland or water, etc. So definitions. Article 2. Each contracting party shall designate suitable wetlands within its territory for inclusion in a list of wetlands of international importance, hereinafter referred to as a list, which is maintained by the Bureau established under Article 8, etc. And they'll be selected on the basis of this. Now, this article gives control. So let's just say you as a country thinking about signing up to this. All countries are concerned about their own sovereignty, and so they don't want to be told by others what to do. And if we think about the Ramsar Convention and this obligation, who is in control? If you as a country, let's just say China or the US, either of those countries, they're big countries, they would say that they can look after their own wetlands. If they sign up to the Ramsar Convention, who's in control? They are. It says each contracting party shall designate suitable wetlands. They don't get told. They nominate. So they sign up, but they're still in control of their own country. Really important from the perspective of thinking about the politics of the country agreeing to this. Okay, Article 3. The contracting parties shall formulate and implement their planning so as to promote the conservation of wetlands included in the list and, as far as possible, the wise use of wetlands in their territory. And that concept of wise use is the core of Ramsar management. So when you go and look at the manual and handbooks, you see wise use, and they just basically detail what that is. And the obligation is for them to arrange to be informed at the earliest possible time if the ecological character of any wetland has changed or is changing. So ecological character is another core concept. And then Article 4, each contracting party shall promote the conservation of wetlands and waterfowl by establishing nature reserves, etc. Okay, just as an example, I'd like to look at the Meipo Marshes Ramsar wetland in China. So, and just to identify the birds that are here, so we've got the great egret is the big white one, and then those little guys, the flock, are marsh sandpipers, which breed in Eastern Europe, southern Siberia and northern China, then move southwards from Africa and across the southern Asia to Australia. It's a summer migrant to Australia from about August to April, so they're here now. So if you went to Moreton Bay this afternoon and we're down by the mudflats, you would see some of these marsh sandpipers. There's lots of them. So if we just imagine that one of the marsh sandpipers you see this afternoon has flown directly from the Maypo marshes. They have flown in a straight line without any diversions. They've just flown 7,000 kilometres. Now, you know, for that little bird, it's amazing, isn't it? I went to a presentation last year where there was this ecologist speaking, Richard Fuller, I think, from UQ, and he basically talked about this bird, this migratory bird they tracked, which left New Zealand and then flew up and do a round trip around through Siberia, across to Canada, and then back to New Zealand. Like, it's just amazing. And this little bird had this actual tracker on it, and he was saying how everyone in the sort of bird groups were just excited following it online, how it was going. Pretty cool. They're amazing, aren't they? So, and look, can I just say the obvious thing for why, you know, in terms of international cooperation, you know, I said yesterday about why do countries come together to have an agreement? And it's when you have an issue that individual countries can't deal with. And this is a seminal sort of example of that, you know. If because let's just say it's only China and Australia that are involved, but you've got all of those countries in between. If you think about a migratory species needing to stop at critical points and refuel, then if you take out one of the wetlands that it's critical, like you break the chain, then the whole species could potentially be lost. So the idea of migratory species and protecting their habitat, and all the countries where they range needing to work together, is the core about why a convention like Ramsar was created. Okay, so focusing in, the Maypo Ramsar wetland is between Shenzhen and Hong Kong. So we've got here Hong Kong on the peninsula, and Shenzhen on the other side of the peninsula. And the yellow line was the boundary between. Everyone knows that Hong Kong was 100 years that the British had it, and then they handed it back in. You had someone from Hong Kong? Sorry? 1997, the British handed it back. So that line, as I understand it, that was the line, sort of the British territory. And if we focus in, so you see that line again, and notice how on the southern side of the line there's all vegetation, and on the northern side of the line it's all been developed. And as I understand it, that reflects that essentially it was the British territory up until 1997, and since then it's been protected.
Apple is actually from Hong Kong, but then the northern part is actually China, so there is another wetland there.
Yep, and you're from Hong Kong, aren't you?
Yeah.
Yeah, great. So, you've been there?
Yeah.
Yeah, great. Nice to have something in your back pocket, or sorry, in your backyard. Okay, so focusing in on that red area, and you can just see the context, so Shenzhen has obviously, there's been a lot of land reclamation, so what would have been, coastal wetland areas that you would have had, birds and things would have been able to feed in, have now all been covered in and essentially lost. So if we go down, and these are just some images from Google Earth, I'm going to just also mention, for your research papers, let's just say you wanted to do Ramsar and you're going to focus on a Ramsar wetland in Australia or overseas, going on to Google Earth and getting some images. You don't have to literally go there, you can basically use images like this to describe the site and build up your case study. Here's some other images just from Google Earth. So obviously a great area for shorebirds, lots of shorebirds in the and relatively also, just looking at it, relatively low visible pollution. Obviously we can't tell what the water quality is, but there's no apparent litter or cans or bottles. It looks relatively clean. Egret. and then looking across it, Arizona to Shenzhen. And then Shenzhen, I showed you this image yesterday in the introductory lecture. Rapid development from the image in the top right, 1980, small coastal village, fishing village with rice paddies, I presume, spread across it, to now being a massive city. And I'd also mention, so this is also in the context of the Ramsar Convention signed in 1971. It's not as if the Ramsar Convention, while it's protecting wetlands, obviously there's been a lot of development that has developed a lot of wetlands, since it's been created. So it's not that it's been, it's stopped all of damage to important wetlands. Okay, the entry on the list, just to show you. So if you actually go to the Ramsar list, you find an entry like this. So it was designated in 1995, so just before the British handed back Hong Kong to China. It was, shallow coastal bay with extensive intertidal mudflats backed by dwarf mangroves, shrimp and fish ponds. 13 globally threatened species of birds and 17 species of invertebrates new to science are present. An important area for internationally important numbers of wintering and migratory water birds. The site regularly holds over 1% of the global population of at least 3 species of birds. And if you go and look at the Ramsar, there's criteria for when you can list. It talks about the percentages of the global population of species and those sorts of things. So that's reflecting the criteria for listing. So there's ongoing threats though, as I mentioned. So I'm not going to play this, but there's a link if you want to look at it in the lecture slides. There's this really interesting photo essay showing from last year, showing essentially the massive amount of seawalls and habitat destruction still ongoing in China. So the figure there was 1.36 million hectares of intertidal habitat is lost. 51% of China's coastal wetlands have now been lost, and the numbers are similar elsewhere. South Korea has lost 60%. So, huge amount of habitat loss still ongoing. Okay, so that's an example of a Ramsar wetland. Let's just mention another one. So this is the Freyadun Kina Ramsar wetland in Iran. Pretty cool bird there. So obviously Iran there in the top right. And if we focus in on a Google Earth image, so the city of Ramsar is just on the Caspian Sea. So if we're focusing on that red circle, so you see Ramsar identified there. So that's the city where the convention was signed. And then to the east, there's the Freyadun Kina wetland. So if we're focusing on Freyadun Kina, it's a small coastal village with some rice paddies. So here's some birds in it. Those birds. It's entered onto the list on this basis. Freyadun Kina is an artificially maintained wetland in the South Caspian lowlands. Comprises 4 damgars, i.e. shallow freshwater impoundments based on rice paddies developed as duck trapping areas, surrounded by forest shrimps and reed beds, and including a wildlife refuge of 48 hectares. You might think, how can that possibly be on a list of internationally important wetlands? Like, seriously, 4 freshwater impoundments for rice paddies, like 4. And its significance actually comes in the next part of the entry, which is that it is an area of outstanding importance as the wintering grounds for the entire western population of the Siberian crane. Listed as critically endangered in the IUCN Red Book, having reappeared on the site in 1978 after 60 years' absence, the number of Siberian cranes now fluctuates between 7 and 14. So, yeah, and the justification for why it's on the red list. I'll talk about the red list in a moment. But yeah, basically it's distributed. So the red list was created in the 60s by the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, a big international NGO. environmental NGO. I'm sure everyone's heard of the Red List, and so it tries to identify endangered species. And the levels on it go from not evaluated and data deficient, least concern, near threatened, vulnerable, endangered, critically endangered, and extinct in the wild, and then extinct. So you don't want to be really anywhere past least concern. But Siberian cranes are critically endangered. So here's the different categories, or just another way of presenting them. So all species, I have a PhD student who's particularly looking at data deficient species and how they're often poorly dealt with. You might think, well, data deficient, obvious, but if you don't know enough, then shouldn't you regard them also? Shouldn't the default be they're protected? Particularly important in environmental impact assessment, where you might be looking at a site and you find a species, but there's very little information about it, and so it's data deficient. So critically endangered, just as an example, a taxon is critically endangered when the best available evidence indicates that it meets any of the criteria for critically endangered and is therefore considered to be facing an extremely high risk of extinction in the wild. So these categories are widely adopted in national laws. And so in Australia, at a national level and at a state level, we have like the Nature Conservation Act in Queensland. At a federal level, we have the Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act. They have categories that allow the federal government and state government to list things, including species, to be critically endangered. And then that gives them some greater protection under the law. So being listed is important for the species in terms of protection, and we are using the categories that the IUCN uses internationally. As my PhD student has pointed out to me, we don't fully adopt the IUCN categories, and it can be confusing how we use them, but let's just say we mostly adopt their categories, but there's differences across the different states in Australia and around the world, how countries adopt it, what categories they use. So here's the Siberian crane. If this was the Western population, that's the entire Western population. So, more than, if we were the Western population of Siberian crane, we would have just, the numbers in this classroom, we would be about, triple them. So, and they're really cool birds, aren't they? So here's their basic distribution. So there's the eastern population and the western population. And you can see Friadoon and Kennar listed overwintering sites. China, in terms of China, the Three Gorges Dam was seen as also big threats to it. So, and I'll just mention also, while we're thinking about the IUCN Red List, that recently they created, in 2013, they also created an IUCN Red List of ecosystems. So if you think about it, if you list a species as critically endangered, you're focusing on the species. But the habitat of the species, particularly for a species that isn't always there, so if you've got a migratory species and you go and do an assessment of a site when they're not there, you're not going to see them. But it's important that that habitat is maintained. Apart from focusing on protecting species, we can also focus on protecting areas. So like we have national parks and protected areas, and then you're protecting the habitat and species together. So either focusing on species or focusing on areas are the two main ways we engage in conservation. And the species protection is, obviously the protected areas is better, particularly if it's a national park, because you're protecting all of the things, the habitat and all of their interactions. But in most countries, that's a very, very small part of their overall land area. So say in Queensland, we've only got about 4% of our state in terrestrial areas, if you say ignore the Great Barrier Reef, but terrestrial landmass, we've only got about 4%, about 4.6% in protected areas. So that means 95% of our state, it's the protection of species based on activities like, protecting them as a species rather than protecting the entire area. That is how we do nature conservation. So ecosystems, using similar categories, it's a relatively new concept at an IUCN level. And instead of extinct, you've got collapsed. So, and I mentioned in lecture 1, a former student of mine did a research on this as a third example of a Ramsar wetland. So she was from the Philippines, and the wetland was in Manila. So just focusing in, you can see the obvious development of the coastline and the reclamation that's occurred. And so this little Ramsar wetland is basically this small remnant bit of mangroves. That's the entry on the list, but it's basically, I'll just show you the next. In terms of flyways, the Eastern Asian flyway, so that wetland is seen as an important sort of link in the chain for a lot of migratory species that move south from Russia down to Australia and New Zealand in the East Australian flyway. And then just to make that a bit broader, there's 8 broad flyways for waders and shorebirds globally. And you've got B there showing the East Asia Australian flyway. So pretty cool. Okay, obviously a lot of threats, apart from physically clearing wetlands, if they're heavily polluted. So this was, that nice student had sent me these photographs as well of the wetland that she did her research on. This was after she'd gone home, and these were pictures of a conservation effort going along and trying to clear up the beach. So you can see the volunteers there. Okay, so many threats to wetlands. The Ramsar Convention, going back to it. Article 6, the contracting parties shall, as a necessity arises, convene conferences. So to discuss the implementation of the convention, additions to the list, etc. So this is setting up the machinery for the administration of the convention. And then at those meetings, they have made important, so just going back, we'll have an advisory character and basically make general or specific recommendations. And so at those meetings, they have defined things like ecological character and change in ecological character. I've got the definitions there. So ecological character is the sum of the biological, physical and chemical components. And I just emphasise, yesterday I gave you a handout about interpreting treaties. So I just really want to emphasise that when you interpret a treaty, you interpret it in good faith. But here's a really good example. If you were interested, let's just say you're working for government and you want to give advice to the government about some property that's listed as a Ramsar wetland within your country, you might go to the convention and read it and see, well, one article refers to wise use, another refers to ecological character. If you only read the convention, you would be really deficient in your understanding of them, because it's the resolutions of the contracting parties that give you a lot of detail. So you need to be aware of that and go and look at the resolutions. And so I'll put that in the major steps. You need to be aware of, in Article 31, Paragraph 3, any subsequent agreement. And that doesn't mean that you've got to go and trawl through all the resolutions and do, huge amount of research, because the big conventions like the Ramsar Convention, the World Heritage Convention, they have consolidated the resolutions into basically user-friendly formats and then adopted different versions of handbooks. So a large number of official documents for the implementation of the Ramsar Convention basically have been consolidated into what's called the Ramsar Handbook. I've just got a screen grab of, I think, version 17. And the sorts of things that it talks about are Ramsar information sheets, so trying to record what is the ecological character of a wetland when it's listed, so that you've got a baseline to measure change again over time. And so while, the Ramsar Convention's been important, it's not stemmed the rapid loss of wetlands globally. So from 1980 to 2000, approximately 35% of mangroves were lost, and some 30% of seagrasses have been lost in the last 100 years. So up to about 50% of coastal wetlands. Okay, so thinking about that, if you think about your research topic, I've asked you to evaluate the implementation evaluate the effectiveness of the implementation of an international regulatory framework in a country of your choice. So if we're thinking about effectiveness, one thing I'd caution you against is thinking of it in terms of black and white. Either it's been 100% effective or 100% failure. Because there's a tendency to look at those, you might look at those figures and say, well, the Ramsar wetland has failed. Who think the Ramsar wetland has failed looking at those figures? Anyone? But it hasn't been a rip-roaring success, has it? It hasn't. If you just think of that as those broad percentages, 50% of coastal wetlands, you might think, well, that's probably at least a 50% loss of associated species in terms of their total numbers, even if you haven't lost species, individual species within that. That's still a huge loss of migratory species. But what I'd caution you about is it's just don't be black. It's not black and white. Effectiveness is not black and white. So the Ramsar Convention hasn't stopped all its destruction happening. At the same time, it's had a lot of, what you've probably saved is, well, it's certainly saved a substantial part of wetlands that, like the Maypole marshes, you can see that, there was all this development in Shenzhen, and then on the British side, it wasn't developed, and was listed as a Ramsar wetland. I should actually clarify that, because I'm just thinking about it. That mightn't be a good example, because it may have been that the administration of Hong Kong and the British just wanted to have a bit of a gap in terms of development there. So it might just be the leftover bit that they then have, listed as a Ramsar wetland. They didn't want to develop that area, so Shenzhen was developing. It might be the end result of that. I don't know. What's your thoughts? Was there a conscious effort to protect Maypole in Hong Kong before its listing? Or is it just basically creating a bit of a natural buffer between it and Shenzhen?
Maybe, because I know the pollution in that bay is actually very serious.
Mm-hmm.
But then I know that Shenzhen, so the northern part, there is another wetland that is managed by Chinese government.
Okay.
So yeah, maybe it's really good.
Yeah, so I suppose it's just not as simple as saying the Ramsar Convention was effective in protecting that wetland. There could have been a whole range of other reasons, but certainly if I think about Australian wetlands that I'm familiar with, the Ramsar Convention is significant in their ongoing management, and places like Moreton Bay, which is also a Ramsar wetland. Ramsar Convention, like all international laws, has to be implemented, and I just want to give you an example of how difficult the implementation can be. And I also want to make the point that sometimes regulators have to fight. And an example of that is an Australian case, ironically called the Greentree case. It was against a fellow called Ronald Greentree. Ironically, he was the largest private wheat grower in New South Wales, and had a whole series of court cases against him for illegal land clearing. So his name was Greentree, but he never saw a tree that he didn't want to chop down and plant wheat. So this case involved clearing in northern New South Wales. This was the wetland before the clearing. So, and just to give you context, the owner of the land at the time it was listed in 1997 voluntarily agreed to a portion of their land being listed. Then after it was listed, Ronald Greentree bought the property, was told by the federal government that it was a Ramsar wetland and he couldn't clear it, told them to basically go and get stuffed, and proceeded to clear it in preparation for planting of a wheat crop. So that's it in 2003 after being cleared. And then here are some images that the federal regulator used in its prosecution. You can see this little red line. So the wetlands this Ramsar wetland was a mosaic of remnant wetlands across northern New South Wales, the Guadar wetlands. So this isn't all of it, this is just part of it. So basically that little portion in that polygon, the red polygon. So that's it in 2002. And then this is, you can see the red polygon in 2003, and you can see on the northern side of the watercourse, basically everything being cleared, ready for planting a wheat crop. And then here's some other images. So they use a lot of satellite images. Our federal laws created in 1999 in Australia, the Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act, created an offence of, I think I've got it there, Section 16. A person must not take an action that has or will have a significant impact on the ecological character of a declared Ramsar wetland. So key term there being ecological character, and notice it's defined to have the same meaning as the Ramsar Convention. So there's a direct link between our national environmental laws and this international convention. And you'd have to basically go and look at what ecological character means under the convention to interpret our national laws. So this is a good example of a country basically incorporating, as I said yesterday, the Ramsar Convention doesn't bind you and me. It's Ronald Greentree didn't he didn't breach the Ramsar Convention by clearing a Ramsar wetland because it doesn't apply to him. It applies to Australia. Australia has created laws to implement its obligations under the Ramsar Convention, and this is a part of those laws. And you can see it adopting terms from the Ramsar Convention. Okay, so that's an example of the Ramsar Convention and fighting. And before I say that, the politics around that case were extreme at the time. So it was 2004, we had the Liberal National Party in power. So it was the Howard government, and the Minister for Environment at the time was a Liberal parliamentarian. This guy was the biggest wheat grower, private wheat grower in northern New South Wales. So you can imagine the politics about a Liberal National Party prosecuting him for clearing on his land. And anyway, it was really remarkable that they took him on, and they basically got one of the biggest, they got orders from the court saying that he had to stop and had to replant the area. And also there was a fine of about $450,000 against him and his company for doing it. It was, at the time, it was the biggest fine imposed for land clearing anywhere in Australia. So really big deal at the time. And a good example about regulators having to fight and landholders, this guy had bought the land. No doubt he paid less for it. He would have said to the guy who was buying it from, it's got that bloody protected area on it, that's no good to me. Probably knocked the money off, in the purchase, but then as soon as he bought it, proceeds to clear it. So it's not like you have to be, I don't have any sympathy for Ronald Greentree. You might have some sympathies for him. I have zilch.
Do they actually enforce the penalties?
Do they actually enforce? Yeah,
they do.
I've got yes is the simple answer. If you don't pay the penalties, then the default is you go to jail.
Yeah. So
he was a very rich fellow. He wouldn't have, in his companies, they wouldn't have had any problem paying them. Okay, so that's Ramsar Convention. Hey, cool, really interesting convention, and a great example about the importance of international cooperation. The next one we want to look at. Does anyone want to take a break? Are we happy to go on? World Heritage, exciting topic. Okay, I get the vibe that we're happy to go on. So, Ramsar Convention, 1972. World Heritage Convention, 1972. Great year, great vintage year. Lots of fabulous people born in 1972. The World Heritage Convention, so the convention concerning the protection of world cultural and natural heritage, so big title, again, everyone calls it the World Heritage Convention. That's its, the international symbol for it. Okay, so 191 parties to this convention, so basically universal adoption. 193 to 196 countries in the world, 191 of them are parties to this convention. Only 167 of them actually have properties on the World Heritage List, which is interesting. You know, there's quite a few who don't have any properties listed, but they're still a party. 1,073 properties listed, including 832 cultural, 206 natural, and 35 mixed, as at today. And yeah, great website. So you can go onto the website. Fabulous. I won't go there, but this is just a screen grab. There's this interactive map. You can basically zoom in on whatever country you're interested in, and you can then click on the different wetlands, different sites, and there's links to details about the site. So it's really cool. So if you are interested in World Heritage, you go and have a look at your country. Australia's got 43 or 53 sites, so we've got a lot. Australia's been one of the drivers for the World Heritage Convention. And yeah, it's been a big part of our international diplomacy for the last 50 years. The catalyst for the World Heritage Convention was a decision in the 1950s by the Egyptian government to build the Aswan High Dam, which would have flooded the valley containing the Abu Simbel temples. I'm going to come back to that and play you a little bit of it, but I'm just going to give you a snapshot of a few World Heritage areas. So the Abu Simbel temples, the pyramids, the Great Wall of China, Vietnam, Machu Picchu, Great Barrier Reef, and Gondwana. So the Abu Simbel temples, located in Egypt. This is the temples, but as you'll see, it's got a really interesting what happened to it. In 1959, after an appeal from the governments of Egypt and Sudan, you see UNESCO, the United Nations, is it the Environment and Scientific, UNESCO. Everyone knows the acronym, and I'm forgetting what the letters all stand for. Anyone help me out? Scientific, cultural, yeah, I think it's cultural organisation. UNESCO launched an international safeguarding campaign. The Abu Simbel and Philae temples were entirely dismantled, moved to dry ground, and reassembled. And I'm just going to play you a really small little clip. This is from the World Heritage site, but it's just amazing what they did.
Nubian monuments from Abu Simbel to Philae. The Nubian region of the Upper Nile has many ancient Egyptian monuments. The largest is the Great Temple of Abu Simbel. The temple, carved out of a rocky hill, was built by King Ramesses II. Egypt became a very powerful kingdom under his reign during the 13th century BC. He built the temple to show the might of his kingdom to the Nubian people. He'd had difficulty in putting them under Egyptian control. The temple faced the threat of being submerged during the construction of the Aswan Dam in the 1960s. There was an outcry worldwide against the plan, and steps were taken to save the site from submersion. This resulted in a large-scale project involving 50 countries, led by UNESCO, to relocate the entire temple. It was cut into 16,000 blocks for relocation. No explosives were used. The relocation project was successfully completed in 1968. Its success led to the eventual adoption of the World Heritage Convention 4 years later. Even though the temple was moved, its direction and position in relation to the sun was maintained. The temple is 63 meters deep and dark inside. There are statues of ancient Egyptian gods along with the statue of Ramesses II in the innermost part of the temple. The king had deified himself. Another ancient monument which had been submerged under the dam was also saved 4 years after the Abu Simbel relocation. It was a temple of Isis. The temple used to stand on a small island known as the Pearl of the Nile. It was relocated to another similar island. The temple was built during the 4th century BC. Isis was believed to be a goddess of eternal life and resurrection. There is a carving of Isis breastfeeding her child on the wall of the inner temple. Abu Simbel has the same angle it had in ancient times. The same phenomenon occurs at dawn on every spring and autumn equinox day. At 6:29 a.m., the first rays of sunlight stream through the temple to cast light on the statue of Ramsar II. The rising sun is a symbol of resurrection. The temple has been brought back to life. The statue of Ramsar II shines on.
So, every time I see that, I just think it is amazing to think of cutting that thing. You know, you think about doing a jigsaw puzzle. Well, imagine a 3D jigsaw puzzle that you're cutting all those big blocks in pieces, and then imagine if you dropped one, you know, like, oh, sorry, I broke the head of Isis, sorry. Can we glue that back together? Yeah, anyway, pyramids of Egypt. Pyramids of Giza. Amazing pyramids. No need to tell you about their history. World famous, the Sphinx. Another, obviously, another World Heritage Site being the Great Wall of China. Actually, the Great Wall of China is, you know, there's a very complicated history to it. This map just shows different stages of it being constructed. Here's some images of, you know, famous sections that are still in good shape, and a section near Beijing, which is one of the ones that tourists particularly go to, and it's really well maintained. So, one that does anyone like Avatar here, the movie Avatar? So, I love it. I think it's just a fantastic movie. And you know the floating mountains, what are they? The floating mountains that they go to in the movie. So it's based on this World Heritage Site in China. So just wanted to show it to you. Doesn't that look awesome? So you can really see how they got what are they? The floating mountains of Pandora, must be. The floating mountains of Pandora that they go to in the Avatar movie are based on these. And I'm a keen rock climber too. So I look at this and I go, oh wow, look at all those great cracks. Ha Long Bay, Vietnam, another famous World Heritage Site, extremely beautiful. So northern part of Vietnam, and yeah, incredibly beautiful. And then another site, Machu Picchu. Who's been to Machu Picchu? Anyway, incredible. Sorry?
I've been there.
Yeah, you've been there?
Beautiful.
Many times, or?
No, just once.
Okay. Yeah, it looks amazing. So in Peru, and I find this shot amazing. You know, can you just imagine building it? But I imagine, you can imagine a lot of people fell to their deaths. But I also think with this, it really shows you the amazing amount of work you can get done if you've got several thousand slaves, you know? What you can do, what you can't do with, you know, good body of slaves. Okay, jumping back to Australia, the Great Barrier Reef, wet tropics. Queensland actually has 5 World Heritage Sites. So I've marked them all here: the Great Barrier Reef, the wet tropics, Fraser Island, the Gondwana Rainforest of Australia, which is a mosaic of rainforest patches in Queensland and northern New South Wales, and the Australian fossil mammal sites at Riversley. There's actually another site, companion site in that one in South Australia. So Great Barrier Reef, picture of Whitehaven Island, where I'm from. Sorry, not literally from, but from the Whitsundays. So love that whole area. And there's a couple of friends of mine just walking on the beach there. Went paddling through the Whitsunday. Just an amazing spot. If you haven't been to the Whitsundays, definitely have to go there. This is my partner. Went sailing, and it's just going across the passage. A really, really beautiful spot. Okay, final example of World Heritage, Springbrook, that a field trip goes to tomorrow. This is where we basically, a picture taken where we get out of the bus and look out from the lookout and the view that we see. This was just a nice little, very friendly, completely harmless python, which just happened to be beside the track back in 2011, so but completely harmless. It was quite funny because it was just behind one of the waterfalls, and literally you couldn't walk anywhere. So literally, like if my computer is just beside my hip, you basically had to walk right past this snake. And so all the class was going through, and I stood there, and it just said, as everyone came through, I just said, "Look at the beautiful little snake. It's completely harmless." And then you should have seen the look on the faces of people sort of going by, going. Because you're literally walking, as close as the seat beside you is. That's how close you had to go to this curled up. It wasn't quite asleep. You could see its eyes sort of watching you, but completely harmless python. Okay, and then you can walk down on the Worry circuit. Tomorrow we won't go on that circuit. I've done it a few times, and I love it. It's a beautiful walk, but I also see that if I've taken 50 people there, there'll be 45 will really enjoy it, and then there's half a dozen you see by the end of it they're not enjoying it. So we're not going to do that. We're just going to do a much shorter walk than the Worry circuit, but that's the bottom of the hill. So the Gondwana rainforest of Australia is this. You can see basically the patches there from Port Macquarie. There's a series of basically the remnants that haven't been cleared of rainforests. And Gondwana, as you know, was the Great Southern Land, the supercontinent. So these patches are listed because they contain a lot of species traced back to Gondwana. So if we focus in, Springbrook is really just part of the series of national parks that stretch along the Queensland-New South Wales border, including Mount Barney and the like. Fantastic series of national parks. So, the World Heritage Convention, let's just look at a couple of articles from it. So, Article 1, for the purposes of this convention, the following shall be considered cultural heritage, and there's definitions: monuments, groups of buildings and sites. So, the World Heritage Convention is not just natural sites, it's also culture, so Great Wall of China, the like. Article 2 has a definition of natural heritage. So it starts with definitions again. And then Article 4 gives some of the obligations, or is one of the key obligations. Each state party to this convention recognises the duty of ensuring the identification, protection, conservation and presentation and transmission to future generations of the cultural and natural heritage referred to in Articles 1 and 2 and situated in its territory belongs primarily to that state. It will do all that it can to the utmost of its own resources and where appropriate to fulfil that. And then Article 8, an international committee, or actually I should go back to Article 4. Again, who's in charge for implementing your obligations? The states, the parties. So that's really important. Again, I emphasise it. Countries sign up as a party, but they haven't just given up control of their country and that a group of other countries can list all of these properties as World Heritage. Article 4 gives them control. So Article 8, an intergovernmental committee for the protection of the cultural and natural heritage of outstanding universal value called the World Heritage Committee is established within the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organisation, UNESCO. So there's all the words. It shall be composed of 15 states state parties to the convention elected from the General Assembly, and it shall be increased to 21. It's now has been increased to 21. So that's the World Heritage Committee. And here's a meeting of the World Heritage Committee. It meets once a year, and 21 representatives elected from the General Assembly. So this was the 36th World Heritage Committee meeting in St. Petersburg in 2012. So Article 11 creates the World Heritage List. Every state party to this convention shall, insofar as possible, submit to the World Heritage Committee an inventory of property forming part of the cultural and natural heritage situated in its territory and suitable for inclusion in the list provided for in paragraph 2 of this article. And then 2, on the basis of the inventories submitted by the states, the committee shall establish and keep up to date and publish under the title of the World Heritage List a list of properties forming part of the cultural heritage and natural heritage as defined in Articles 1 and 2 of this list. And then 3, the inclusion of a property in the World Heritage List requires the consent of the state concerned. The inclusion of a property situated in a territory, sovereignty or jurisdiction over which is claimed by more than one state shall in no way prejudice the rights of the parties to the dispute. Okay, so again, who is in control? The states, very clearly. And I again emphasise it's critical to understanding why these conventions are so popular. Why does everyone sign up to them? Why do you think countries sign up to the World Heritage Convention? Why would you even list them? You know, like if you're a country, why would China, for instance, list the Great Wall of China? I mean, why?
Tourism.
Bingo, tourism is a big deal. But also think about status. Like, to get on the World Heritage List, it has to be recognised as being of outstanding universal value, so of importance to the whole of humanity. So, yes, there is the tourism, but from a status perspective, a country having properties listed in its territory that are of outstanding universal value, it's a great status thing, and yet they still retain control of them. So it's sort of like everyone's a winner. And if you think about it, the Great Wall, like the pyramids of Egypt, for instance, the Great Wall of China, obviously Egypt would want to protect them because they draw in so much tourism, and it's in part important for their culture and history as well. The Great Wall of China, there's a clear reason for China to preserve and maintain those anyway. Similarly, properties in, say, Australia, we've protected all of these areas as national parks, like the Gondwana Rainforest of Australia is really what's left after we've pretty well cleared everything else. These were national parks that have been around for decades. Lamington was one of the first national parks in Australia and in the world. So Springbrook and Lamington, they've been around since, I can't remember if they were listed in 1910 or something like that. So we already basically fully protected them. So in nominating them to the World Heritage List, they're already protected, and we're basically also getting the status of this being a property of outstanding universal value. I've answered that question already. Why does every country in the world, basically, why are they a party to it? Because of status, because also they aren't giving up their sovereignty over their own land. They're still in control. So Article 11, this is the list of World Heritage in danger, so which was a subset of the World Heritage List and meant to basically, the original intention was that then international funds could be basically used to try and protect those sites. So if a site was deteriorating and there was a country that was very poor and couldn't afford to maintain it, or the example being the Aswan High Dam being built and the moving the temples, things like that could be funded by the international community to preserve them. So the list of World Heritage in Danger wasn't intended as so much a bad thing. I mean, it's bad to be on it, but it wasn't intended as a penalty to the country that has that, has a property listed. It was intended to help that country. So Article 11.4, the committee shall establish, keep up to date and publish under the title of List of World Heritage in Danger, a list of property appearing on the World Heritage List for the conservation of which major operations are necessary and for which assistance has been requested under this convention. So see, this convention grew out of the Aswan High Dam and the Temple example, and basically, particularly the US, but the global community said at that time, well, this is really good that we've preserved this, but why don't we establish a framework to make this more, actually establish a system for international cooperation to help fund these things instead of them just being ad hoc. And that was the genesis of the whole World Heritage Convention. So, Article 11, the committee shall define the criteria on the basis of which property belonging to the cultural or natural heritage may be included in either of the lists mentioned in paragraphs 2 and 4. Again, I'd emphasise then, you can go and read the convention, but to actually understand its implementation, you have to look at the operational guidelines. So this is just the July 2013 version. They keep getting updated. So you would go to the, if you're working for government, you're dealing with World Heritage issue, you'd go and look at the operational guidelines. Similarly, if you want to do a research paper related to a World Heritage property, go and look at the operational guidelines. So this is just some extracts of them. Operational guidelines, paragraph 49 defines the criteria. So these are the criteria for listing for cultural heritage. So Roman numeral 1 represents a masterpiece of human creative genius, etc. And then 6 to 8 reflect the natural heritage. So you've got, for instance, Roman numeral 7 contains superlative natural phenomena or areas of exceptional natural beauty and aesthetic importance. So tomorrow we'll go to this incredibly beautiful area. We'll look out, you'll walk behind all of these waterfalls, and it really reflects that superlative natural phenomena, exceptional natural beauty and aesthetic importance. Similarly, Great Barrier Reef, incredibly beautiful. So to be deemed of outstanding universal value, property also has to meet the conditions of integrity and authenticity and must have adequate protection and management system. So this is one of the sort of sticks that the World Heritage Committee can use. They won't list something unless their country is willing to protect it sufficiently. So an example of failing to report is a recent example from Australia where under the World Heritage Guidelines, countries are supposed to report to the World Heritage Committee if there's a threat to the outstanding universal values of the properties. So back in 2010-2012, there's this massive mining boom in Australia, particularly in Queensland and New South Wales, and coal companies were wanting to basically expand ports all along the coastline, as well as a big expansion of coal seam gas and liquefied natural gas going on at Gladstone, led to large and rapid development in the Great Barrier Reef. And that then led to conservationists complaining to UNESCO that Australia was in breach of its obligations and hadn't reported it. UNESCO then, in response, contacted the Australian government and suggested that Australia invite a monitoring body to come and have a look, to check it out for itself. So Australia invited a reactive monitoring mission got sent out, and these two people, Fanny Duvert and Tim Bachman, wrote this really hard-hitting report. Like when I read it, because you read most international documents and reports, and they're just so wishy-washy. They never criticise anyone. They're never hard-hitting. This is a hard-hitting report. It is really. You can go and put the link there in the slides if you want to go and have a look at it. But basically they focused on development along Curtis Island, which these big gas trains were being built, liquefied natural gas, refining plants were being built. And yeah, basically it led to a whole heap of concern from UNESCO. This reactive monitoring report said basically Australia is in danger of breaching its obligations and damaging the World Heritage values of the Great Barrier Reef. Now, think about that from the Australian government's perspective and the Queensland government's perspective. Like, what do you think of the domestic politics of that being found by... So, the World Heritage Committee can't order Australia not to do that development. The Australian government under the convention still has control. But what do you think of the politics going on here? If UNESCO says, you're damaging the Great Barrier Reef, what do you think the Australian and Queensland governments are going to say about that? Are they going to tell them to, go and get stuffed? It's our reef and we'll trash it if we want to? So what do you think is the support in Australia for the Great Barrier Reef, protecting the Great Barrier Reef? Pretty high? Yeah, it's through the roof. Like, you talk about iconic natural, places in Australia, massive tourism draw cards. The Great Barrier Reef is number one. It is incredibly important economically.
Across the state line.
You never will hear a politician say, we're prepared to wear damage to the reef. They always explain projects like, coal-fired power saying, oh, we're not really damaging the reef. You'll never hear them accept responsibility for damage to the reef. So it's basically just political poison to do that. So the Australian government and the Queensland government reacted with horror to this damning international report, even though there was no legal power under the convention for the World Heritage Committee to order Australia to do anything. Domestically, there is so much support for the Great Barrier Reef, and neither government wants to be seen as, permitting damage. So the committee was considering listing the Great Barrier Reef or entering it on the list of World Heritage in danger. That's what they were considering. And from an Australian domestic perspective, that was politically poisonous. Also, Australia has invested a huge amount in the World Heritage Convention. It's one of its sort of flagships. It would be internationally very, very damaging for Australia's reputation also to have, basically, you've got a finding that you're being negligent in your management of this incredible site. So the Australian government and the Queensland government put huge effort into trying to basically convince the World Heritage Committee that they had dealt with it. Now, so there's a whole heap of planning and extra levels of planning and reporting back to the World Heritage Committee, but fortuitously, basically after this report was really written at the peak or just past the peak of that development boom, and since then coal prices have crashed, and also the LNG prices petroleum prices have been low, so basically there's been a lot of the proposals for port expansions have just basically gone away because of the market conditions. So it's fortuitous for Australia and Queensland because they could turn around and say, well, look, there's no longer the pressure. There's no longer this threat, don't list it. And at least at this stage, the World Heritage Committee has said it's still continuing to monitor it, but it's not listed it. So does that give you, I think it's a useful example to understand, like conventions like this, the driver might still be the party. And the country voluntarily signs up to it. And even though they're not technically bound, they're still in the driving seat. The World Heritage Committee's, what it did in this case was a really strong driver for improved management of the site. And it's all not about being legally bound by it, but the politics of it. And that's really, really important to understand. Okay, I don't want to World Heritage is I actually will mention it just very briefly. So in Australia, World Heritage has been a really, really significant part of our history, and also our relationships between our levels of government. Because Australia in its has a written constitution. We divide up between our national government and our state governments power to make laws with respect to different topics. So, for instance, police. If someone was to run here and shoot me, you guys won't hurt, but and then run out. That person will have committed a crime, murder, and there would be a breach of the Queensland Criminal Code, and they could be arrested by the Queensland Police, and they would be prosecuted in Queensland courts. So that's at our state level. Our federal government has a range of heads of power that it can make laws with respect to. And there is no specific head of power in relation to general criminal law. So federal law doesn't deal with that sort of instance. In our system, it's a state issue. The federal government deals with a range of issues, including things like customs, immigration. So if you come from overseas, you would have gotten a visa from the Australian government. So all of those things are dealt with at a national level. Under our constitution, we also have, I'll come back to it. Basically, in 1983, there was a dispute between the Tasmanian state government and the federal government about the management of a World Heritage property, and it led to a seminal decision of our highest court about what powers the Commonwealth government could make. What power the Commonwealth government had to make laws to fulfil Australia's international legal obligations. And effectively, the High Court found that if Australia has entered into a treaty under which it's accepted obligations, the federal government can make laws with respect to that topic to fulfil Australia's obligations. So it really changed the constitutional arrangements in Australia, or fleshed out what they were. So it involved the damming of a river called the Gordon below. The dam was to be built on the Gordon River. One of the tributaries of it was the Franklin River. This is an image from this. It was an iconic image that was used in the campaign at the time. It was a picture taken by Peter Dombrowski. It shows Rock Island Bend on the Franklin River. And the Wilderness Society at the time and the campaign against it ran full-page ads basically saying, would you vote for a government that would destroy a place like this? And so it's located in southwest Tasmania. This is some of the maps that were used in the High Court case. So basically, the Franklin River flows south here. It joins the Gordon River, which is flowing in from the south, and then they flow west. The dam was to be built just beneath their junction, and then it flows out to the west coast of Tasmania. A decade before, there'd been a massive dam built on the Gordon River higher up. It was called the Gordon River Dam, and your classic high dam. So this huge campaign was launched to stop the damming of the Franklin River. And it led to the Commonwealth government. Bob Hawke was elected on a campaign to stop the damming of the Franklin River. It went very quickly to our highest court. It was this big constitutional dispute, and the High Court decided that the federal government had the power to stop the damming of the river, even though it was essentially a state government corporation in state land. As I mentioned, we have a written constitution. Section 51 sets out federal powers for our national or federal government, and Article 51(29), so down here, all the Constitution says is the Commonwealth Government shall have power to make laws for the peace, order and good government of the Commonwealth with respect to external affairs. So it was ambiguous what that meant. But so our Constitution was written in 1900, 1901. A primer to how we got to the High Court case was back in the 1930s when aeroplanes started flying around. The federal government made laws about basically air navigation. And there was nothing in the Constitution dealing with air navigation, obviously, because there weren't any planes in 1901. But those laws were held to be lawful because Australia had agreed to international rules for air travel. And it's pretty obvious that you want to deal with it at a national level. You don't want to have, change in rules when you get to the border. Instead of passing on the left, you pass on the right. Those sorts of things have been held to be lawful, and then using that sort of reasoning, it was accepted by a majority of the High Court that because Australia had accepted obligations to protect World Heritage, that the national government could make laws to protect World Heritage, even though it's about activities within Australia. It's not just about things external to Australia, but activities within Australia. So basically the federal government laws override state laws to the extent of inconsistency. There's ongoing battles about this. So there's been recently the Gillard government, which was a Labor government, extended the boundaries of the southwest Tasmanian World Heritage Area. And when the next government was elected, the Abbott government, which is a Liberal national government, they tried to basically redraw and take back out the areas that had been added in. So they went back to so this is just a map showing southwest Tasmania is in green, and then the World Heritage boundary, basically the bits in crosshatching they wanted to take back out, and the World Heritage Committee said, no way, we just listed it as World Heritage meeting the criteria, there's no way we're taking it back out. So once nominated, you've lost a bit of control, but so that's the World Heritage Convention. I'll just deal with a couple of other things and then we'll take a break for lunch, eh? Does that sound okay? Stockholm Convention, CITES, but very quick. Cool. Okay, so World Heritage Convention, really cornerstone of our modern system, really famous. And the main thing I'd like you to remember is, these are really popular conventions. There's a reason why they're really popular. And states are still in the primary driving seat. So that joining up to a convention doesn't mean you necessarily lose control. And it's a big component of international negotiations is countries, while agreeing to certain obligations, they still want to be able to control activities within their own borders. Okay, so around that time as well, there's the Stockholm Conference. Very famous, seen as another critical step in the development of international thinking about environmental issues. So, Stockholm Conference held in Stockholm in Sweden in 1972, attended by 113 countries, widely recognised as the beginning of modern political and public awareness for global environmental problems. There was a Stockholm Declaration, including, just as an example, Principle 1, man, so very sexist language reflecting the times. Man has the fundamental right to freedom, equality and adequate conditions of life in an environment of equality that permits a life of dignity and well-being, and he bears a solemn responsibility to protect and improve the environment for present and future generations. Okay, so Stockholm Declaration, won't dwell on it. Very briefly, another convention around that time is CITES. So Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Flora and Fauna, 1973. You can see why everyone calls it CITES rather than the full name. So very briefly, convention starts with the normal preamble stuff. 160 parties to CITES, all the countries shown in green. And similar sort of structure, Article 1, some definitions. Species and specimens include things that are both living and dead. So if you think about something like an elephant tusk, the elephant's been killed, the tusk can still be regulated under CITES. And then Article 2, basically it sets up a series of appendixes for which further protection is provided. So, and those appendixes, just to summarise them, there's roughly 5,600 species and 30,000 species of plants protected under CITES against overexploitation through international trade. 3 CITES appendices. You've got their flora, fauna, Appendix 1, 2 and 3. And just as an example, elephants. So obviously everyone knows the horrors of elephant trade. So example here, a dead elephant killed for its tusks. Yeah, and a huge issue for the protection of that species. So linked to trade, made into a whole heap of things. This is just a map showing areas of distributions of the African elephant. And yeah, I'm not an expert on elephants. You see different reports, and some national parks, they seem to be so well managed that they're a problem because there's too many of them. But as a general, the general reports you see is that overall the populations are hugely threatened, continue to be threatened due to trade. So yeah, this is just an extract of their listing. So listed under Articles 1, 2 and 3 at different periods. So Article 1 since the 1990s. So you see there CITES Appendix 1 included except populations in a few countries, which are included in Appendix 2. And yeah, this is just an example of an article talking about illegal harvest for commercial trade has recently surged, and basically, yeah, talking about ongoing killing of elephants. And this was just an extract from the article. So elephants, often a very popular topic with particularly students from Africa for their research paper. So, and finally, the Bonn Convention, 1979. So I don't want to spend much time on CITES, just wanted to mention in passing the appendixes, it's trade related, but comes in this period. Migratory species, 1979, the CMS, Convention on Migratory Species, or commonly known as the Bonn Convention, signed in the German city of Bonn. 120 parties, relatively limited compared with Ramsar World Heritage and CITES. You can see the countries there that are party in green. Fundamental principles basically protecting migratory species. Again, they set up appendixes where they can be listed. Yeah, don't want to basically spend any more time on it than that. CMS, Bonn Convention, similar in many ways to Ramsar and CITES, but also covering a lot of other species, so turtles and the like. I'm not covering, obviously, there's a lot of other, I'm mainly focusing on, obviously, the large multilateral treaties. There's a whole heap of little treaties like JAMBARD, the Japan-Australia Migratory Bird Agreement, CAMBA, the China-Australia Migratory Bird Agreement. So we've got all these little, which are bilateral agreements between those countries and Australia about migratory birds. So there's a whole range of other, individual treaties. We're just painting the big picture of the big multilateral ones. Okay, don't need to talk about Gondwana. I just wanted to say, so tomorrow for our field trip, we're meeting at the bus at 8 o'clock, and we're going down to Springbrook. So to come on that, a pair of good shoes, a hat, bring your lunch. That's pretty well it. It's going to be a really fun day. Love you guys all to come along. Yeah, we've got the field trip photo competition. So if you can't come, we'll have some photos later in the week as well. So to wrap up, you've got a question? So I'm aiming for 5. So we'll aim to leave no later than 3, because sometimes we get caught in traffic. It might be slightly after 5, depending on traffic. But yeah, aim to be back by 5. I think I've said on the information sheet back by 6, but I aim to be back by 5. Does that sound cool?
Yes.
Yep. Yeah. So we'll aim to leave by 3. Yeah, and I've certainly been caught in traffic before, and you're sitting there, and sometimes it ticks a little bit past 5, but we'll be around, around about that time. Oh, sorry, anyone else got any questions about the field trip tomorrow? Hope you're excited. I love it. I just can't go there enough.
Sorry, how challenging is there?
It's not challenging.
No?
No.
It's not?
You can walk, you're fine.
Yeah.
It's not hard.
Okay.
I did have one year a student who was in a wheelchair, and I organised 2 helpers to come, but I was way over ambitious. Things that you normally just walk past when you're actually with someone in a wheelchair, you just see that it's impassable. Like you would have to be lifting down over all of these rocks and stuff, and he ultimately just stayed at the top. You're not in a wheelchair though. If there was someone in a wheelchair, I would say I would plan around it. But I did, one year go thinking we'd do the walk with him.
And how much are we going to walk?
About 4 kilometres.
Okay.
It's not hard. We'll stop. We'll have morning tea. We look at waterfalls. We stop for lunch. About 4 to 6 kilometres. It's really easy. So we walk along the top and back, and it's all a trail. So and we walk behind waterfalls and the like. It's really beautiful. Honestly, we don't do the 18-kilometre walk anymore because I just saw the sad faces of the people coming up the hill. Who are not enjoying it, and I want you to enjoy it. So it's there to and really the cool bit is you walk behind all this. It's the most action-packed walk. I reckon you can go up. If you find a more action-packed walk than the 4 or 6 kilometres that we're going to walk anywhere in the world, I would be amazed, because we walk behind a series of 2 or 3 waterfalls. We walk literally behind the veil. The trail goes behind the veil, and we also get to look at them from the top, from lookouts. So we just sort of do this circuit. It's really cool. Yeah. Okay, so that's the field trip tomorrow. Okay, so we've covered Ramsar World Heritage CITES. In summary, groundbreaking environmental treaties in the early 1970s. They provide the cornerstone of the modern international environmental regulatory system. There's later agreements and technical manuals agreed by the parties can be important in interpreting treaties. I really want to emphasise that. So the Ramsar and the World Heritage Convention's operational manuals are the sorts of things you need to go and look at and be aware of. You can easily find them on their websites. And finally, international law does not protect the environment without effective implementation into international laws. And often that can be really hard and controversial. It ain't easy. So for further reading, heaps of information on those sites. I highly recommend, just for fun, going and having a look at the World Heritage site and going into that map and look at your own country, go and have a look at a few sites. Huge amount of information there. Similarly, the Ramsar has got a really good website. Go and just have a play around, have a bit of an explore. There's so much information there. They're really, really good sites. So I just don't think textbooks really capture that. Go to the websites. It's so much better. Okay, so that's the lecture.